September 19, 1944, Bisson-la-Petite, northeastern France. Shrouded in the morning mist, the 113th Panzer Brigade advanced with its Panthers as if marching on certainty. In the command tower, Colonel von Jungenwald even laughed. "If there is resistance, it will be brief." After all, the report spoke only of light-armored and American screening positions. No real threat. No weapon capable of slowing down German steel. That laughter, however, was about to be silenced. Not for larger tanks, not for elaborate ambushes, but for a vehicle that German manuals didn't even consider relevant. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer. Open, light, underrated. A project that rejected everything Germany believed about armored warfare. And that morning he rewrote the rules with engine, speed, and surgical precision. This video reconstructs in detail the technical, doctrinal, and psychological shock that the Germans experienced when facing the M18. A weapon that won not by strength but by speed. Not for protection but for strategy. In the end, only one truth will become evident. The Panzers were not only defeated, they were outclassed. What the Germans called a suicide tank proved to be just the opposite. But before we dive behind the scenes of this historic turnaround, there is a statistic that defines everything to come. In Ericourt, 39 Panther tanks, pride of German engineering, armored with up to 100 millimeters of steel and costing more than 100,000 Reichsmarks each, were destroyed by open vehicles less than half the weight and costing less than half the value. Their name? M18 Hellcat, a tank destroyer that seemed too improvised to be there. And yet, it redefined combat. What seemed like logistical suicide became technical superiority, and behind this turn there was not only steel, but a philosophy that Germany never saw. If you value history told with data, accuracy, and respect for the truth, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This allows us to continue revealing the forgotten details that changed the course of the war. When the 113th Panzer Brigade was ordered to move toward Ericourt, there was one certainty that did not need to be discussed among its officers. The Panther was superior. It was the tank that embodied the German doctrine of mechanical supremacy, a vehicle developed not only to win combats, but to dominate battlefields. From the beginning of the war, the Wehrmacht's armored strategy had been built on the progressive escalation of power. The Panzer had been an emergency solution, the Panzer III the first to bring real offensive capabilities. But it was the emergence of the Tiger I and then the Panther that consolidated the view that victory was to be found in the thickest steel, the longest gun, the most imposing structure. Each evolution brought with it an obsession with raw power, heavier turrets, frontal armor from 80 to 100 millimeters, high-velocity guns with long-range penetration. For the German General Staff, this was the only possible response to the Soviet advance in the east and the threat of landings in the west. It was the logic of mastery via engineering. The heavier, the better. The problem is that this logic did not allow exceptions. The German philosophy of armored warfare was centered on tanks as hammers, heavy, slow, almost unbeatable, with a central offensive role. They didn't just lead attacks, they were the attack. And this imposed a way of thinking that ignored fundamental variables: agility, speed of replenishment, maintenance logistics, and above all, real-time tactical adaptation. The Panzer's operational structure was divided between firepower and endurance. The Panther's 75mm long guns were lethal at over 2,000 meters, and its frontal armor ricocheted the shells of most Allied tanks. In theory, it was a fortress on rails. But what happened when this fortress encountered an enemy who did not want to fight head-on? In France, the Germans were still operating under the ghosts of 1940. The memory of the Blitzkrieg made them believe that the Western battlefield would bow down again before their tanks. But the world had changed. The United States had gone to war with an intact industrial base, an ocean as a shield, and a completely different strategic mindset. While Germany was betting on increasingly sophisticated and time-consuming tanks, the Americans were preparing vehicles that were functional, reliable, and above all, at scale. And here comes the fact that the Germans never wanted to see. In 1944, the United States produced, on average, 2,500 tanks per month. Germany in the same period was struggling to exceed 380 Panthers per month, a number that included replacement vehicles, training units, and multiple fronts. The difference was not just numerical, it was doctrinaire. The Americans accepted losing tanks, because they could replace them in days. The Germans did not. Each lost Panther was an irreplaceable piece, a symbol of strategic investment that could not fail. But it failed. Constantly. If this number surprised you, write in the comments. Logistics wins. Because at this point in the war, she was already winning. German doctrine did not ignore speed. It only subordinated it to power. But while the Panther could reach up to 46 km/h on the open road, this number was theoretical. In the field, the 45-ton weight and chronic transmission and overheating problems limited the tank's actual maneuverability. In contrast, the Americans were designing vehicles with lighter suspensions, adapted airplane engines, and automatic transmissions. An M18 Hellcat could reach 89 km/h on the road and maintain 64 km/h on medium terrain. He wasn't just faster, he was unbelievably faster. The German doctrine did not foresee facing ghosts. It planned to face tanks that responded to the same rules. But the rules were changing. The big German mistake was not to build heavy tanks. It was waiting for the enemy to play the same game. The commanders in the field, veterans of the Eastern Front, were prepared for head-on duels, exchanges of fire at long range, superiority in range. When they faced the first Hellcats, they realized something unsettling. The enemy did not stay to fight. It attacked from the flanks, disappeared before the turret completed its rotation, returned minutes later from another angle. What Germany saw as weakness, a light armor, an open chassis, a vulnerable crew, turned out to be part of a different equation: speed plus coordination plus mass production. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, father of the Blitzkrieg, had already warned in 1943, "We will not have the time nor the resources to sustain a protracted war against enemies who can produce 10 times as much as we do." His words were not prophecy, they were an ignored diagnosis. And it is precisely this silent contempt for the factor of production that begins to erode German confidence in 1944. In Ericourt, the numbers did not lie. The logic of weight began to be crushed by the speed of adaptation. But the real breakdown of doctrine would come minutes later, when a Panther commander would see a Hellcat accelerate from an ambush, fire 2 shots, destroy a German armor, and disappear before its turret had even completed its rotation. What was impossible was now repeatable, and it was about to become doctrine. The birth of the M18 Hellcat was not just a technical breakthrough, it was a conceptual rupture. In early 1942, while the Germans were perfecting the Panther in direct response to the Soviet T-34, replicating the logic of more armor and greater firepower, on the other side of the Atlantic, an American officer observed the same blitzkrieg through another lens. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, at the head of the newly created Tank Destroyer Training Center at Fort Meade, Maryland, did not see the war as a weighty duel. For him, mobility was the essence of survival in the modern countryside. American doctrine was still confusing. The Army did not know whether tank destroyers should be offensive vehicles, defensive vehicles, or just mobile reserves. Bruce went further. Instead of a tank to face tanks, he proposed something different. A vehicle that was not afraid to expose itself because it would never stay in the same place. One that didn't rely on passive survival, but on quick attack, evasion, and constant repositioning. He proposed, in cold, direct words, a light, fast tank destroyer that can flank and disappear before the enemy reacts. It was the opposite of the European mentality, and for this very reason, his proposal was almost discarded. The philosophy that would give rise to the M18 was simple and revolutionary. The best armor is not to be hit. At a time when tank designers were vying for millimeters of steel and ever longer calibers, Americans made a decision that seemed suicidal: to deliberately give up protection. In exchange, they prioritized 3 pillars: top speed, effective firepower, and mechanical reliability. The initial concept, named T-70, would be the embryo of the M18. And here begins one of the fastest, most daring and effective projects of the war. Less than 2 years separated the first idea of the vehicle and its scale production, a logistical and industrial feat that alone already put the U.S. at an advantage. Development was assigned to the Buick division of General Motors. Unlike German factories, which were stuck with artisanal processes and time-consuming refinements, Buick engineers brought a civilian mentality to the military field. The chassis would be designed based on lightness, using precise welds, torsion bar suspension, more stable and faster, and a Wright R975 radial engine, originally used in airplanes. While the Panther required a hand-assembled Maybach, the Hellcat would use an already existing mass-manufactured, reliable, and easy-to-replace engine. The turret, made to rotate fast, was light and functional. The automatic transmission, derived from the civilian automotive industry, allowed any average recruit to learn how to operate the vehicle in days. No experience was needed. It was necessary to scale, and that the Americans had. The Hellcat's frontal armor barely reached 25 mm in some areas. The roof was open. The crew compartment was vulnerable to any shrapnel, but that was the cost of a speed that no other armored vehicle in the war could match. In tests, the M18 reached up to 60 mph, about 96 km/h, on the road, an absurd number for a tank destroyer. The German textbooks did not even foresee the possibility of facing something like this. It wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a conceptual gap. While the Panther took more than a minute to complete the rotation of its heavy turret, the Hellcat could lock onto a target and reposition itself before the opponent realized its position. On the field, this meant attacking from the flank, firing and disappearing, and contrary to what many thought, the 76 mm gun of the M18 was not inferior. Using M62 APC ammunition, he was able to penetrate the side and rear of the Panthers with relative ease, as long as it hit the right angle. And the Hellcat always looked for the right angle. The philosophy behind the M18 did not seek direct confrontation. She sought control of time and space. While the Panther was a slowly advancing wall, the Hellcat was a blade slicing invisibly, and this difference would become decisive when both met in Aracourt. But before that, there was a lesson that Germany had not yet learned. Speed is not just movement. It is doctrine, production, and mentality, and America was moving faster on all of these fronts. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this fast-paced doctrine left the first trail of smoke in the rugged fields of Italy, and why the Panther's first technical defeat came not from a head-on engagement, but from a flank where it never expected to be hit. The M18 Hellcat's superiority didn't start on the battlefield. It started at the factory. More specifically, on the lines of the Buick Motor Division in Flint, Michigan, where the logic of civilian automotive production was applied to the war with merciless precision. Unlike the German facilities, which relied on skilled craftsmen, labor-intensive and quasi-artisanal processes, Buick operated under a philosophy of standardization. The Hellcat wasn't just a weapon, it was a high-scale industrial product. With existing tools, trained mechanics in weeks, and interchangeable parts, the U.S. has achieved the unthinkable, producing a complex war machine with the same mindset as family cars. While assembling a single Panther required about 2,000 man-hours, that of an M18 took less than 500. While a Panther took weeks to roll off the line, Hellcats could be manufactured in daily batches. The chassis, simple and lightweight, eliminated costly steps. The R975 radial engine, already produced on a large scale for planes and tanks such as the M4 Sherman, was easily attached to the vehicle. And more than that, its maintenance was straightforward. It only took a 3-man team to completely replace the engine of a Hellcat in less than 2 hours. In contrast, changing a Panther's powertrain could take days, when components were available, which was already rare in 1944, with Allied bombing raids disrupting the supply lines of the German arms industry almost weekly. The secret was not only in fast production, but in logistics planning. The Hellcat is designed to be simple to carry, easy to operate, and quick to train. The technical manuals were objective, and the learning curve for the crews was short. If a Panther needed highly skilled operators, the Hellcat could be entrusted to young recruits with basic training. This difference created a silent multiplier effect. While the Germans could get tanks to the front with difficulty, the Americans put in vehicles, parts, fuel, ammunition, and men trained with mathematical synchronization. The advantage was not just quantitative, it was structural. The U.S. Army operated as an assembly line extended to the battlefield. And this assembly line did not stop. In January 1944, Hellcat production peaked, 250 units per month, a number that alone surpassed the combined production of German Panthers, Tigers, and Jagdpanzers in that same period. Germany's war was a war of scarcity, that of the United States a war of excess, and in Aracourt, this difference would become fatal. But it began there in Flint, where civilian factories were retrofitted in weeks to produce combat machines that not only worked, but worked within a larger system of efficiency. What the Germans saw as technical inferiority was actually system superiority. A Hellcat might not survive a direct hit, but the question was, how many Hellcats could you lose before it made a difference? The answer was disconcerting to any Wehrmacht officer. Dozens. And even then, the U.S. would still win the exchange. The Hellcat parts came from several plants connected by a robust and protected rail system. Its modular design allowed for quick upgrades, in-field replacements, and makeshift maintenance. The Germans, on the other hand, suffered from disrupted production lines, shortages of metal alloys, and a railway system collapsed by air raids. Even the steel used in the armor was a source of tension. The special steel needed for Panthers competed with that used in submarines and heavy guns. Each Panther produced was, in practice, a gamble. Each Hellcat, a statistical investment. And the statistics, as it turned out, were on the American side. This doctrinal difference was also manifested in the philosophy of combat. The German tank was a mechanical masterpiece, yes, but it was also a burden. It needed to be preserved, protected, treated with caution. The Hellcat, on the other hand, was disposable in industrial terms, and this gave tactical freedom to the crews. They could dare move forward without fear of losing an irreplaceable resource. When war becomes mathematical, freedom becomes a weapon, and the Americans were armed to the teeth. This is where historical irony reaches its apex. While the Germans designed tanks to impress generals, the Americans built machines to win campaigns. While Hitler's engineers debated armor thickness, Buick's engineers measured assembly time. As German tanks slowly traversed Europe, Hellcats arrived by ship, descended ramps, and within 48 hours were operational. It was a war waged at the pace of industry, and this industry knew no retreat. But the real test was yet to come. In September 1944, the silent Flint factory would begin to echo in the plains of Lorraine. The first real confrontations between Panther and Hellcat were approaching, and when they finally happened, they revealed something that no technical table predicted. The weight that was supposed to protect the Germans would be exactly what would make them lose. When the first M18 Hellcat arrived in the Italian theater in early 1944, there were no high expectations. The mountainous terrain, narrow roads, and the predominance of static collisions seemed incompatible with the philosophy of speed and avoidance that defined the project. Still, 5 operational prototypes were delivered to the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion and sent directly to the Anzio beachhead, one of the most tense fronts on the Southern Front. There, under continuous fire from German artillery, and amid the mud and confusion of urban and rural fighting, the M18 was put to the test, and it surprised. Despite the natural limitations of the terrain, the Hellcats showed that they could move fast enough to change positions between shots, cut flanks unexpectedly, and attack from unlikely directions. In practice, what the Germans saw as an underrated armored vehicle became a disruptive tactical piece. It wasn't the armor that protected them, it was the speed that kept them from being hit. And although the scale of the fighting at Anzio did not yet allow for a definitive conclusion, the American units learned the most important thing there. The Hellcat did not need open field to be lethal. He just needed space to run for seconds, and that was enough to turn the tide. The reports that came back from Italy were not noisy, but they were clear. The crews reported firing accuracy, absurd maneuverability, and the ability to infiltrate and escape with unprecedented efficiency. What began as a doctrine experiment revealed a new form of anti-tank combat. It was as if, for the first time, an American tank destroyer could choose when and where to engage the enemy. The Germans, for their part, were not sure what they were up against. Many Wehrmacht accounts describe light, fast, probably reconverted vehicles, a perception that revealed the unpreparedness to deal with a tank destroyer designed from the beginning to be invisible until the first shot. The irony of this story is that the solution to beating heavy armor was not to increase the caliber, it was to accelerate. And the Americans had found that path long before their opponents understood that the game was changing. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the weapons, doctrines, and decisions that change the course of warfare. The experience in Anzio not only validated the project, she directly influenced the training and redesign of the Hellcat's employment doctrine. The most important lesson was clear. The M18 worked best as a striker, not as a line of defense. A vehicle that had to be kept in reserve to intervene with speed, strike, and retreat before the enemy understood the movement. The American anti-tank doctrine was beginning to move away from the European model for good. Instead of fortifying and resisting, the Americans began to outflank and surprise. The tactics developed there would be perfected in the following months and taken to northern France, where terrain conditions and German expectations of armored supremacy would create the perfect scenario for the next surprise. What the Germans called armor too light to be taken seriously was about to become their greatest threat, and it would reveal itself brutally on Ericourt's misty mornings. In September 1944, the U.S. 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was deployed alongside the 4th Armored Division in preparation for the defense of the Ericourt sector in the Lorraine region. The front was unstable, covered in constant fog, and the German command believed that it would face another barrier of Sherman tanks, slow, predictable, dependent on numerical superiority. The intelligence of the 113th Panzer Brigade did not report any relevant anti-tank forces in the sector. The German plan was straightforward: break through the fog curtain, destroy the outposts, and pierce the American rear. The advance began on the morning of September 19th. The Panthers were advancing in formation at about 5 miles per hour, with the engines operating at low revs to avoid sound detection. Ahead, the fog hid everything beyond 50 meters. It was then that the first Hellcats, hidden in previously calculated positions, gave life to what seemed like an invisible trap. Unlike what the Germans were used to, there was no fixed ambush nor prolonged resistance. What happened was a movement. A Hellcat would emerge, fire from a side or rear position, and disappear before the Panther's turret had completed half of its rotation. In less than 5 minutes, 5 Panthers were destroyed. The psychological impact was immediate. The German commanders searched for the enemy in conventional positions, but found nothing. The Wehrmacht's fighting doctrine, based on defined fronts, was dismantled by an enemy who refused to remain visible. Radio communication between the Hellcats allowed for coordinated maneuvers. One platoon attracted the fire, while 2 others repositioned themselves for the slaughter. The Panther turret, weighing 7 tons, could not keep up. Its hydraulic system, dependent on the engine speed, operated slowly at low revs. The result was predictable. Even before spotting the shooter, many Panthers were already out of combat. The enemy that emerged in Ericourt was not in the manuals. It was not a traditional tank. It was a fast-paced, low-silhouetted piece that treated the battlefield as a space for maneuver rather than a static front. The combination of SCR 508 FM radio, light radial engine, and torsion bar suspension made the M18 a mobile ambush platform. His flank shots hit the Panther's vulnerable spots, sides and rear, where armor dropped to 40 millimeters or less. And every time an M18 attacked and disappeared, it reinforced the German feeling that they were not facing tanks, but appearances. Even experienced veterans of the Eastern Front felt disoriented. After all, the Panther had been designed to face the Soviet T-34. Fast, yes, but within a still recognizable logic. The Hellcat broke this logic. He didn't duel. He couldn't resist the impact. He attacked and disappeared. German counterattack attempts were disorderly. As they chased the Hellcat's trail, several Panthers experienced mechanical failures, overheating, powertrain problems, track loss. The weight of 45 tons was beginning to take its toll. In one morning, the 113th Panzer Brigade lost nearly 10% of its armored strength just trying to react to an enemy that always seemed one step ahead. The concept of a mobile tank destroyer, considered inadequate by Wehrmacht strategists, had materialized as a tactical nightmare, and most unsettling to the Germans was that nothing in the conventional command structure seemed to work against him. Behind the scenes, the impact of these losses began to echo in the reports. An officer in the brigade wrote days later that, "The armor and range of our guns are of no value when the enemy does not allow us time to lock on." It was a confession. The enemy had abandoned the traditional battlefield, and in the void left by that absence, the Hellcats shaped a new kind of warfare, silent, fast, and lethal. And while the Germans tried to understand what they were up against, factories in Flint, Michigan continued to produce more. In the next chapter, we'll look at how Hellcat engineering turned mobility into doctrine, and why the Panther's flanks, hitherto considered safe, became the entrance to the end. The M18 Hellcat did not beat the Panthers because it was tougher, nor because it fired first. He won because he redefined the equation of time on the battlefield. Each component of the Hellcat has been designed with a single goal: absolute mobility. The Wright R975 radial engine, originally developed for airplanes, offered 400 horsepower in a vehicle weighing less than 18 tons. This allowed for an unrivaled power-to-weight ratio, almost 22 horsepower per ton, more than double that of a Panther. This advantage translated into real speed: 89 km/h on the road, 50 to 60 km/h on uneven terrain. For a ground combat vehicle, it was an anomaly, but the real revolution lay in the ability to move before the enemy could react. At Aérocourt, this meant that the M18 could come up, fire, and disappear in less than 10 seconds. The Panther in turn took 20 to 30 seconds to rotate the turret, locate the target, and line up the shot. It was a war fought not in kilometers, but in seconds. Torsion bar suspension, successfully introduced on the M18, replaced coil spring systems and allowed for greater stability at high speeds. This reduced the impacts of moving fire, something unthinkable for the heavier German tanks. While the Panthers lost accuracy when moving on uneven ground, the Hellcats could shoot more accurately, even on the move. The combination of agility and precision turned each ambush into a seconds-long operation. And to operate in sync, the Hellcats had another differential: SCR 508 FM radios installed in all vehicles. Unlike the Germans, who still relied on limited AM systems, the Americans used frequency-modulated radios, with less interference and greater clarity. This allowed for clear, fast, and secure communications between platoons, a decisive element in coordinated ambushes. The Panther was a fortress, but it was also deaf, blind, and slow when compared to a mobile system of interlocking hunters. Its manual gearbox required constant attention from the driver. Its powertrain, hastily designed to compensate for excessive weight, was vulnerable to failure and difficult to repair. Its high center of gravity made it difficult to maneuver quickly in curves or make sudden retreats. The Hellcat, on the other hand, had everything the other way around: automatic transmission, simple controls, direct maintenance, and low chassis. While the Panther required specialists, the M18 was operated by recruits in accelerated training. But it was exactly this pragmatism that made the Hellcat so dangerous. It was reliable, reproducible, and surprisingly effective because of an engineering that prioritized movement over confrontation. In the European theater, this paradigm shift began to impose itself quickly. The U.S. Army, realizing the value of the M18, began to integrate it more strategically into mobile units. The tactic was no longer a front line, it was a flank, a distraction, and a planned retreat. The battlefield ceased to be a board and became a flow. Whoever moved, dominated. And the Hellcats moved like no other piece there. It was like playing chess with pieces flying over the board. The Panthers, optimized for firepower and frontal armor, found in the M18 an opponent who simply refused to play by the same playbook. This new way of fighting was beginning to be recognized even by the Germans. An 11th Panzer Division report, dated October 1944, mentioned light vehicles capable of flanking at unbelievable speed, impossible to engage with frontal tactics. It was a veiled admission that the battlefield had already changed. The Panther was still a threat, but only if the enemy accepted the duel, and the Americans were no longer dueling. They were hunting, and they hunted fast. In the next chapter, we will look at the psychological impact of this change on German commanders, how the Panzer Doctrine, based on direct force and technical superiority, began to collapse in the face of an enemy that not only moved faster, but thought faster, because in the end, it wasn't steel that defeated the Panthers. It was time. At dawn on September 20th, 1944, the village of Richeur-Light, shrouded in thick fog, became the scene of an ambush that would change the German perception of the fields of Lorraine. Under the command of Lieutenant Charles Leiper, a platoon of Hellcats from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion took up positions along a tree-shrouded ravine. The engines were running, but idling, barely audible. The tactic was clear: attract, outflank, destroy. Ahead, the muffled sound of German mats grew. A group of Panthers slowly emerged from the fog, their towering silhouettes clipping through the thick white. They were looking for frontal targets. But the Hellcats weren't ahead. They were on the flanks. And there, American Doctrine proved its accuracy. The first shot came from the Hellcat positioned on the right, hidden behind a destroyed barn. The 76mm shell hit the side of the Panther with enough force to ignite the ammunition inside. In less than 4 seconds, the German tank was on fire. 2 other Hellcats opened fire simultaneously, each aiming at the rear sides of their targets. Within minutes, 5 Panthers were out of action. Leiper's Hellcat crew switched positions even before the Germans could locate the point of origin. The rapid movement, coordinated by FM radio, created an effect of active invisibility. The Americans shot and evaporated. The mobile ambush doctrine, theorized at Fort Meade, came to life with mathematical efficiency, and at the center of this theater, the Germans found emptiness, an enemy that responded not with force but with speed. The Panther's superiority, built on the logic of range and armor, disintegrated in the face of an adversary that never remained where it fired. The Panther's tower, slow, became useless in confrontations of seconds. The side armor, vulnerable, did not resist the Hellcat's ammunition at well-executed angles, and the German command, accustomed to static combat, had no immediate response. The tanks tried to turn to meet the attackers, but the formation had already been broken. In practice, the ambush at Richelieu was not just a tactical victory, it was a demonstration of how speed, coupled with efficient communication and coordinated doctrine, could dismantle a superior enemy on paper. The scene would repeat itself throughout the morning with subtle variations but similar results. Within 5 minutes, 5 Panthers destroyed. American losses, 0. What the Germans saw as technical inferiority was actually a new form of combat. The after-action reports detailed not only the hits, but the speed at which the Hellcats changed positions. One fact drew attention. The vehicles moved, shot, and retreated in cycles of 12 to 15 seconds. The average reaction time of a Panther, about 30 seconds. The war there had become an equation of time, and the Americans were winning every second. Pause for a moment, because here's one of the statistics most ignored by German planners. By September 1944, the U.S. had produced more than 60,000 combat FM radios, distributed among tanks, light armor, and infantry commandos. Germany, still stuck with fragile AM radios and limited range, did not reach 10,000 operational units on the entire Western Front. This wasn't just a difference in equipment, it was a difference in thinking. If this number surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because in this war, the radio was as important as the cannon. Richelieu's ambush became a milestone within Lorraine's campaign, not only for the efficiency of the attack, but for the message it conveyed. For the first time, the Panzers did not know where the next shot would come from, not because the enemy was hiding, but because he was in constant motion. The American doctrine ceased to be theory and was consolidated as practice. The battlefield was no longer a place to be dominated, but a flow to be controlled. And whoever controlled the time, controlled the combat. But the real impact of the ambush would come hours later, when the radio of the 113th Panzer Brigade intercepted an American transmission that, translated and analyzed, said, "Objective complete, repositioning to the second line." The enemy that the Germans thought they were hunting had already left the scene and was ready to strike again. In the next chapter, we will see the psychological effect of this new war on German officers, the reports of confusion, the breakdown of confidence in armored superiority, and the first signs of a collapsing doctrine. Because true defeat does not begin with the sound of a gunshot, it begins with the silence that comes after. In the western sector of the European front, where once the heavy, rhythmic sound of panzer columns advancing with confidence could be heard, now hung the silence of doubt. The field reports that returned to the German High Command in September 1944 carried a new tone. Disorientation. Veteran troops, forged in battles such as Kharkov and Kursk, accustomed to facing waves of Soviet T-34s in brutal and predictable engagements, now described engagements against moving and invisible targets arising from impossible directions with no identifiable tactical pattern. The myth of German superiority, sustained by years of advance and mechanical mastery, was beginning to crumble not by the force of heavier weaponry, but by the intelligence of a lighter doctrine. The Panther, which on the Eastern Front imposed itself as an absolute predator, became a vulnerable prey in Aracourt. Each attempt at a counterattack was thwarted by enemy movements that exceeded the machine's response capabilities. Each ambush plan was rendered useless by the speed with which the Hellcats flanked, fired, and disappeared. It was as if the Americans had redesigned the war in real time, and the Germans were reading an old manual in a language that no longer made sense. The rigidity of the German armored doctrine became its own poison. Commanders trained to think in terms of force concentration and frontal superiority could not understand a threat that did not respect formation, axis, or direction. The platoons of Hellcats operating in trios or quartets multiplied through valleys, forests, and villages, each acting as an autonomous cell, but coordinated via radio. It was a decentralization that the Germans could not imitate. The Prussian philosophy of central command, so effective in advance campaigns, proved too slow for a mobile ambush war. On the field, this translated into delayed decisions, uncoordinated responses, and increasingly fragile morale. A commander of the 11th Panzer reported, "These are not tanks. They are fast predators who do not respect our logic. They shoot and disappear as if they knew every meter of the terrain." Even more alarming was the psychological impact on the Panther crews. Those who had once felt protected within the steel fortress were now permanently on their guard, fearing ambushes from an enemy that gave no room for error. The frontal armor, up to 100 mm, became useless when the attack came from the side, from a blind spot. And as if that weren't enough, the Panther's weight, more than 45 tons, limited its ability to escape. The Hellcat, on the other hand, accelerated from 0 to 50 km/h in less than 20 seconds. It was like pitting a boxer against an armed sprinter. The fight never began. It only ended. The breaking of the myth was not only tactical, it was symbolic. For years, the Panther represented the German answer to modern warfare, a combination of advanced engineering, imposing armor, and long-range firepower. It was more than a tank. It was a symbol of prestige and technical pride. But in Aracourt, this symbol was discredited. With each successful ambush, the Panther's image as invincible eroded. What was honor turned into frustration. What was domination turned into despair. What was an elite now fought with fear. Confidence gave way to caution, and caution to hesitation. And the cruelest thing about this turn was that the Germans were not losing for lack of skill or courage. They were losing because they were facing a war machine that was not just material. It was doctrinal, industrial, and mental. While Germany perfected tanks for duels, the United States built vehicles to win campaigns. While the Germans bet on complexity, the Americans invested in efficient simplicity. And this simplicity, produced at scale and precisely coordinated by radios and air logistics, began to rewrite the manual of armored warfare. Behind the scenes, the Wehrmacht High Command began emergency meetings to reassess the presence of enemy light units on the flanks of Lorraine. But it was too late. The collapse was not just tactical, it was ideological. In the days following the ambush at Richelieu-Lait, contradictory orders, operational hesitations, and changes in positioning emerged that only increased the vulnerability of the German forces. And most telling came from a confidential report from the Oberkommando des Heeres, dated September 23, 1944. The present doctrine of the employment of armored forces is being systematically exploited by enemy mobile forces with superiority of communication and reaction. Immediate review is required. It was a bitter admission. The model that had dominated Europe between 1939 and 1941 was outdated. The future no longer belonged to the heaviest. He belonged to the fastest. And in the next chapter, this future gains face. The faces of the men who manned the Hellcats, the engineers who refused the old dogmas, and the commanders who decided to rely on speed as a weapon. Because behind the machine, there was a mentality. And this American mindset was just beginning to show what it was capable of. The German response to the M18 Hellcat came with delay and desperation. In the days following the Richelieu-Lait ambush, the Wehrmacht's Armored High Command issued orders for the Panthers to operate in fixed pairs, trying to protect each other's flanks. It was a logical but deeply ineffective attempt against an enemy who refused to play for the same board. When one Panther moved, the other stayed. When the two advanced, they lost their reaction time. When they stopped, they became targets. In practice, the new tactic turned them into static sentinels, nullifying their greatest virtue, offensive power. And even more, it revealed a historical reversal. For the first time since the French campaign, German tanks were not leading the advance. They were trying to survive. Germany's armored elite, symbol of the Blitzkrieg, now acted as entrenched infantry. trapped by the rigidity of steel and the slowness of myth itself. The biggest German mistake was trying to respond to speed cautiously, but the war against the Hellcats allowed no respite. Every minute stopped was an opportunity for the Americans to reposition, communicate, and strike again. FM radios, installed in all Hellcats, gave the unit a collective situational awareness. The Panthers, with their communication fragmented and dependent on messengers or visual signals, operated as if they had been fighting in the previous century. The battlefield was no longer a tank clash. It was a mobile network of decision and reaction. And the Americans decided faster, reacted earlier, and set the pace. The change in posture was evident on the movement maps of the 113th Panzer Brigade. Once marked by pincer advances and siege operations, the September records showed improvised lines of defense, erratic turns, points of retreat. The Panthers were repositioned to protect strategic areas, no longer to conquer territory. Many began to operate from static positions hidden behind buildings or covered by vegetation, waiting for an enemy that never came from the front. The German instinct for frontal combat, the armored duel, had become a burden. Against Hellcat, there was no duel. There was hunting. The biggest paradox was this: the more Germans tried to protect themselves, the more vulnerable they became. A hidden, stationary Panther was even easier to flank. Without full mobility, he became a perfect target, and with each attempt at a counterattack, the same pattern emerged: hesitant advance, coordinated ambush, American withdrawal, loss of armor. Operational reports recorded growing frustrations. One platoon commander wrote, "They show up, shoot, and disappear. We react to emptiness." It was the confession that Germany no longer commanded the battlefield. He reacted to him, and always late. The symbology of this turn cannot be underestimated. Since 1940, the world has associated armored warfare with the image of the Panzer advancing in formation, crushing resistance, making its way through. Now, those same machines were hidden, trying to guess where the next attack would come from. The pride of German engineering, charged with expectation and confidence, had been placed in a position it should never occupy: defensiveness. And while the tanks waited, the Hellcats moved. As the Germans looked ahead, the Americans attacked from the sides. As the Panther prepared to fire, the Hellcat had already retreated 200 meters. The irony of this reversal was total. The army that had revolutionized the war with speed now suffered in the face of it. The tank that was born to lead was now kept as a support piece. The doctrine that called for tactical aggression now begged for restraint. And morale, once sustained by the certainty of technical superiority, now sank under the weight of steel itself. On the field, the veterans began to question, why is our tank the best if he can't fight? And while Germany adjusted tactics on the field, the United States adjusted its production at home. More Hellcats were rolling out of Buick's factories, now with up-to-date training, refined doctrine, and increasingly confident operators. Aérocorps combat, which was supposed to be an American resistance in the face of the German retake, became its opposite, a demonstration of dominance, speed, and operational intelligence. The weight has become an obstacle, strength has become a limitation, and the advance turned into a retreat. In the next chapter, we will follow the faces behind this turn. The American operators, young, trained for speed and flexibility, who piloted these machines as extensions of their own thinking, because before the mechanical victory, there was a mental victory, and this one, the Germans never expected to face. The transition from supremacy to survival does not always come about through visible explosions or defeats. Sometimes it manifests itself in the blank stare of a commander at the end of the day. In the Aérocorps sector, this moment came silently, like the very fog that covered the fields. The Panther crews, accustomed to facing frontal combat with moral and technical superiority, began to fear the invisible. In the records of the 111th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, terms appear for the first time that until then were not part of the German operational vocabulary: tactical disorientation, unpredictable enemy, rapid disappearance after eye contact. These were not just material losses. They were psychological breaches that opened up in experienced soldiers, forged in brutal campaigns in the East. The difference? In the East, the enemy came en masse. Here, he came from where one did not expect, and disappeared before the answer. It was a new, technical, modern fear. The M18 Hellcat turned the battlefield into uncertainty. Where once the Germans had advanced with maps and plans, they now hesitated, even with numerical superiority. There was a break in the cycle of trust. The tankers no longer trusted the armor. They no longer believed in the range of their cannons if they could not lock on. They no longer saw the advantage of remaining if the enemy was always on the move. The doctrine that taught to face and overcome has lost its meaning, and when the tactical sense fades away, what remains is instinct. And instinct said, survive. The moral collapse began with silence in the Panther's towers, when radio operators hesitated to confirm that they were being flanked. Again, fear was more than a sensation. He shaped decisions. Units stopped exploring flanks, preferring static zones. Internal reports showed tanks abandoning positions for fear of ambushes. In one of the excerpts from the 15th Panzer Division's war diary, a sergeant wrote, "Our eyes are on the horizon, but the shots always come from behind." The war had ceased to be a confrontation between armies. It had become a contest between doctrines, and German doctrine, built on domination, slowly sank into its inability to adapt to the invisible enemy. It wasn't the Hellcat that won anymore. It was the idea behind it. Psychologically, the impact was as profound as any strategic defeat. The tankers no longer saw their Panthers as shields. They saw them as traps. The stuffy interior, the slow towers, the difficulty of retreat. Everything that was once a symbol of power now seemed vulnerable. With each patrol, the tension grew. At every turn in the road, the sudden appearance of an American shot was expected. There was no more linearity. The battlefield was an arena where the enemy dictated the pace. And this rhythm was not that of strength, it was that of speed and absence. They don't have to face us. All they have to do is show up and disappear, and we have already lost the fight. This phrase, recorded in an interrogation with a captured officer in October 1944, sums up the general feeling. The war had changed, and with it, the psychological balance. The difference between a tank and a trap was in what was expected of it. The Panther had been designed to dominate, but stuck in its own complexity, it has become a difficult weight to move. The Hellcat, designed to escape, to move and react, reversed the axis of the confrontation. The M18 crew entered the fight with the advantage of choice. They could engage or not, and this tactical freedom, multiplied by radio and mobility, corroded the minds of those who were forced to wait. The tank that does not move ceases to be a weapon and becomes a target, and the soldier who waits for the attack ceases to be a hunter and becomes hunted. As the weeks passed, this transformation began to show in the numbers. The survival rate of the Hellcat crews was 3 times higher than that of the Panthers, and more than numbers, they were patterns. The Hellcats were rarely hit in the open. Their losses occurred in defensive ambushes, urban areas, or when abandoned due to mechanical failure. The Panthers, on the other hand, even in the defensive field, were systematically eliminated by lateral attacks. The most ironic? The Hellcat was considered inferior on paper. Less armor, smaller caliber, lower cost. But it was this minor that made him more lethal, because modern warfare no longer rewarded the strongest. Rewarded was the force that adapted. At the end of September, a new term began to circulate among German troops on the Western Front, Geistjäger, the ghost hunter. An informal nickname, whispered among radio operators and ammunition loaders, referring to the M18 as something that you don't see, but you feel. The war, for the Germans, was now a constant wait for something that could not be predicted, and from that moment on, the battlefield ceased to be physical. It became mental. In the next chapter, we will look at the impact of this on strategic decisions, how the loss of the armored initiative forced German generals to reorganize entire fronts, withdrawing elite units not to attack, but to preserve what was left of doctrine. Because when fear shapes war, war no longer belongs to those who impose. It belongs to those who surprise. The real difference between the Hellcat and the Panther wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the factory. When the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion lost 2 Hellcats at Richelieu Light, the replacement vehicles arrived in less than 48 hours. Transported by rail, delivered by logistic trains, supplied and ready to operate with the same crew. It was the natural extension of an industry made not only to supply, but to sustain a doctrine. Meanwhile, the Germans, by losing 5 Panthers on the same day, would face an operational vacuum of at least 10 days. That is, if there were parts, if there was steel, if there was fuel. The time between loss and replacement became a sentence. Because in this war, those who returned to the field faster were not only stronger, they were unbeatable. American factories, operating in continuous shifts, delivered up to 10 Hellcats a day. Mann's Panther work in Nuremberg was able to produce an average of 6 per week, and that at its peaks. The cost of a Panther was equivalent to almost 3 Hellcats, and the mechanical complexity of the German tank required more than 2,000 man-hours per unit, while the Americans, with standardized lines and civilian mechanics, delivered a Hellcat with just over 1,000 hours of assembly. Pause for a moment. The United States was producing combat vehicles at twice the speed and a third of the bureaucracy. If this number surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because the battlefield begins on the factory floor. And there was more. The Hellcat was modular. Its components could be replaced with simple tools. The suspension, the radial engine, the track rails, everything was made with civilian standard parts, often interchangeable with other vehicles in the U.S. fleet. The Panther, on the other hand, was a masterpiece of excess. Its unique components required tailor-made parts, specific techniques, and highly trained workers. Every Panther that came off the production line was almost handmade. Each Hellcat, a cog in a larger machine. And this machine was called total logistics. While the Germans mobilized heavy metallurgy for each tank, the Americans repurposed the automobile assembly line. Buick, which until 1941 produced passenger cars, now manufactured weapons with industrial efficiency. What the Germans called gross simplification, the Americans called war efficiency, and efficiency won. The Germans knew this, but they couldn't keep up. The blockade of raw materials, the bombing of the Ruhr, the fragmentation of factories into underground and improvised units delayed each batch, and most critically, the German philosophy of war did not allow for simplification. A German tank could not only be functional, it had to be a symbol, it had to be superior, it had to carry the technical heritage of a nation that saw in engineering the reflection of its ideal of order. But this order, in 1944, no longer produced victory. It produced weight. With each Hellcat that appeared at the front, there was a Panther waiting for parts. With each American platoon that reorganized, there was a German battalion stuck to its own schedule. American production was not only faster, it was invisible to the eyes of German doctrine. Wehrmacht intelligence reports underestimated the amount of Hellcats available. They estimated a maximum of 250 units on the Western Front. The reality? More than 1,500 had been produced by September, and more than 700 were operating in Europe. This underestimation was costly. Strategic decisions were based on wrong numbers. The planned attacks did not have resistance at so many points, and when resistance emerged, it was mobile, lethal, repositionable. Hell for the Germans was realizing that they weren't facing an elite squad, they were facing a production line. The Hellcat didn't have to be the best tank in the world. It had to be good enough, fast enough, simple enough, and numerous enough. The equation of war has changed, and while the Germans were still calculating the ideal armor, the Americans were already manufacturing the next batch. The fight is no longer a steel dispute and has become a replacement test, a silent race between destruction and surrender, and the United States was racing on another track. American production followed an almost cruel logic in its coldness. It was not enough to win battles. It was necessary to sustain victory, replace losses, standardize parts, training new crews in weeks, not months, integrate logistics with field intelligence. It was a war ecosystem, and the Hellcat, fast, simple, and lethal, was the symbol of this mentality. The Panther, with its technical glory, was the symbol of a war that had been left behind. But the biggest difference between them was not in the tanks. It was in time. Time to produce, to adapt, to react. Time to fail and correct. Time that Germany no longer had, and that the United States dominated as a weapon. In the next chapter, we will meet the faces that brought this doctrine to life, the engineers, operators, and strategists who understood that the future of warfare was not just on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. Because the most powerful weapon of 1944 was not the cannon, it was the stopwatch. The German command, unable to accept the tactical reality imposed by the Hellcats, made its last bet on the ultimate symbol of its strength, the Tiger the Fun, hurriedly sent to reinforce the front at Ericourt. The heavy battalion carried the illusion that the weight still decided battles. With over 57 tons 100mm frontal armor and an 80mm gun that terrorized any target in a straight line, the Tiger was considered invulnerable. But his march over the plain of Lixieres in October 1944 was the moment when the myth began to crumble under its own weight. The scene was almost ritual, the Tigers advancing in formation, slow, determined, trying to impose themselves through volume. On the horizon, nothing, no visible resistance, until the first roar came from the trees and disappeared. A Hellcat, emerging from the left flank, fired and retreated. The Tiger attempted to rotate the turret. Slow, shaky, useless. The second shot hit the engine. Within minutes, a giant was on fire, and the rest of the battalion, which was supposed to retake the region, was forced to group, hesitate, defend. The Hellcats circled around as predators too fast to be tracked. They fired in motion, coordinated by radio, striking the flanks like invisible razors. The Tiger, with its glory and armor, became a statue in the open field, a museum piece within a war that was already another. The Tiger's turret, operated by a manual system, took up to 15 seconds to rotate 360 degrees in a stationary position. In combat, with the terrain uneven and under stress, this time was even longer. For the Hellcats, who changed positions in less than 5 seconds, this difference was not technical. It was fatal. The head-on logic that German engineers had pursued for years no longer applied. The 80mm gun was powerful, yes, but ineffective if there was no time to aim. And time in that battle was Tiger's enemy. With each attempt to maneuver, another flank emerged. With each retreat, an explosion cut off the supply line. Those tanks, built to crush Soviet resistance on open plains, were now forced to respond to attacks coming from unpredictable directions at unattainable speed. More than the material defeat, the arrival of the Tigers and their subsequent failure symbolized the collapse of German armored logic. Faith in frontal armor, the wide turret, gun superiority, all of this crumbled under the reality of a dynamic, fluid battlefield dominated by a doctrine that prioritized speed and coordination. It was as if time had moved on and the Tigers were still struggling in the past. The very presence of these tanks at the front was already a sign of desperation. The logistical cost of moving, supplying, and maintaining a battalion of Tigers was so high that in strategic terms, their mere existence already imposed a burden on the German war machine. Every Tiger destroyed was not just a military loss, it was an economic failure. The frustration of the German commanders was registered. General Hasso von Manteuffel, after the failure of the offensive, is reported to have said in a meeting with the general staff, "We have created monsters that do not know how to hunt." It was the confession that, despite the engineering, the power, and the armor, the German vehicles no longer knew how to operate in the new type of war, because war was no longer about monsters. It was of ghosts, and the Hellcats, light, fast, abundant, had taken on this role. They circulated like shadows, reached and disappeared, confused tactics, broke rhythms. The Tiger could withstand 5 frontal shots, but none on the flank, and the flanks were no exception. They were the rule. The battle at Aricourt was not just a tactical turnaround. It was a doctrinal milestone. It showed that the era of supertanks was over, that the victory did not come from the bigger cannon, but from the quickest decision, that the war was not won in impact, but in repositioning, and that technical arrogance, when confronted with strategic agility, collapses. For the Germans, the lesson was bitter, because Tiger was the pinnacle of his belief, and when the apex fails, what remains is emptiness. In the next chapter, we go to the heart of this new thinking, the American Doctrine Center that rewrote the use of armored hunters, because before moving in the field you need to know where you want to go, and the Americans, before accelerating, already knew the way. By October 1944, while German tanks awaited orders for each move, the Hellcats were already on the march before their superiors knew of the threat. The secret was not only in the engines, but in the invisible waves of FM radio. Each M18 was equipped with a high-frequency communication system that was reliable, jam-resistant, and had enough tactical range to coordinate an entire unit in real time. While the Germans still relied on flares, motorized messengers, or centralized orders, the Americans operated as a swarm, small, mobile groups, interlinked by voice, adapting to the terrain and situation without waiting for instructions from the high command. It was not improvisation, it was doctrine. The American playbook provided not only how to engage, but how to react, how to divide forces, how to rearrange under fire, like breaking through and coming back. It was the war of flexibility. The concept of task force was born there. Mixed, temporary units that were formed for specific objectives and disbanded at the end of the mission. At Aracourt, for example, Hellcats operated in coordination with light infantry, field artillery, and real-time reconnaissance scouts. An entire company changed direction within 5 minutes of intercepting a German radio communication, and flanked a Panzer convoy before it knew it. This speed of response was not just the result of technology. It was the result of a doctrine that allowed the sergeant to decide, that he trusted the platoon commander, that empowered those who were seeing the enemy with their own eyes. American warfare was decentralized before the term even existed, and this decentralization deeply confused the Germans. In the reports of the Wehrmacht General Staff, there are curious expressions to try to describe the behavior of American units: erratic actions, improvised responses, out-of-sequence operations. It was not a translation error, it was doctrinal shock. The Germans, trained in a rigid hierarchy, with orders transmitted from top to bottom in a formal chain, could not interpret the fluidity of American movements. They saw a lack of standard where there was adaptation. They saw chaos where there was dynamic coordination, and for this reason they often hesitated. The hesitation, however, was not reciprocated. Americans could make mistakes and correct them in real time. They could lose contact and resume communication in seconds. They could disperse and recompose immediately. The war had changed its playbook. This doctrinal revolution was written not only in the orders, but in the language of command. While the Germans still used terms such as defensive position, wedge advance, and coordinated counterattack, the Americans spoke of a fluid zone of action, reorganization on the march, and engagement for opportunity. It was a new tactical grammar, shaped not by theory but by practice. And in that grammar, Hellcat was a verb of movement, of rupture, of decision. When a commander said, "Move with Hellcats to Sector Charlie," he knew that in less than 10 minutes the answer would be being executed. No intermediaries, no interpretations. The information flowed. The order was action. FM radio, often ignored in technical analyses, was one of the most decisive weapons of the Allied ground campaign. It didn't just connect vehicles, he connected doctrines. It allowed the commander to hear the gunner. It allowed the platoon to know what the infantry saw. It allowed the Hellcat to retreat, warn and attract reinforcement, all in real time. For the Germans, this tactical transparency was unimaginable. Most Panthers didn't even have radios in all vehicles, and when they did, they were rudimentary, unstable, with low autonomy. The result? While the Americans reorganized on the move, the Germans waited for the next order. They waited and lost the advantage. The collapse of German doctrine was not only due to defeat on the field, it was due to the shock of reality, by the realization that they were stuck in an inflexible model, a model where the division commander needed to authorize a local maneuver, where a breakthrough was slowed down because the message was lost, where the technical superiority of the tank was nullified by the communicational inferiority of the crew. The power of voice, radio, immediate order, all of these have set the pace of war, and this new rhythm favored those who could improvise. In late October, an internal report of the 5th Panzer Army concluded, "Coordination among American tanks is unusually fast. They act as if they were predicting our movements. It is impossible to fix positions." It was not a forecast. It was adaptation. American doctrine did not seek to control all elements. It sought to allow each element to decide based on information. And that was the definite difference. It wasn't about having the best plan. It was about being able to abandon it when necessary, and still win. In the next chapter, we will see how this new way of waging war culminated in the complete redesign of the theater of operations in France. Because a doctrine that moves freely doesn't just win battles, it transforms maps. And by November 1944, the maps would begin to move faster than ever. While the Germans counted every shot, every spare part, every drop of fuel, the Americans moved forward with something even quieter: reliability. The M18 Hellcat, with its air-cooled radial engine, operated for hours in combat mode without overheating, even under the stress of Lorraine's open fields. Its drivetrain, derived from the civilian automobile industry, was simple to operate and easy to repair. And most critically, parts could be replaced in the field, without the need for cranes or specialized teams. It was the victory of functional design over technical obsession. Meanwhile, the Panther, the pride of German engineering, suffered from a fatal structural weakness. The rear drive unit, the so-called final drive, often broke down on uneven terrain. Its Maybach engine, although powerful, required constant maintenance, and in battles like Aricourt, dozens of Panthers were abandoned not by enemy action, but by mechanical failures that turned them into steel statues. This is the kind of war that doesn't appear in the photos, the war of availability. The tank that needs 3 hours of maintenance for every hour of combat is not a weapon, it is a burden. And at that point, the balance didn't just tip in favor of the Americans, it collapsed on the Germans. The statistics don't lie. The Hellcat's operating rate on the European front exceeded 85%, while the Panthers, in other words, for every 2 Panthers running, there were 2 others sitting idle, waiting for parts, waiting for mechanics, waiting for what Germany could no longer supply. The Hellcats, with interchangeable parts, light logistics and maintenance teams trained at an industrial pace, were returned to the front line on the same day. American combat efficiency was not only in the field, it was in the rear that functioned as an extension of the weaponry itself. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. While German engineers pursued the ideal of absolute superiority, Americans pursued only constant functioning, and they won. If you're enjoying unraveling these details of the story, the ones that really define the fate of battles, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to reveal what the manuals often forget. Because history is made behind the scenes, and the backstage of this war was called reliability. During the French campaign, the 4th Armored Division reported that the Hellcats ran, on average, twice the distance of medium tanks per day, with no need for technical stop. This continued mobility allowed for surprise attacks, calculated retreats, and nearly invisible redeployments. In contrast, the Panthers suffered even from overly stretched tracks, which broke when crossing villages with rubble. On several occasions, German commanders were forced to blow up their own tanks abandoned by clutch system failures. It wasn't enemy fire that defeated them, it was the maintenance manual. To make matters worse, the Panther's air filtration system didn't handle dust and mud well. Constant conditions on the roads of rural France, and the excessive weight made simple bridges, which the Hellcats crossed with agility, impassable for the steel giants. This created logistical bottlenecks. A Panther stuck behind a broken bridge was a useless Panther. A Hellcat, weighing less than 20 tons, crossed the same stretch, retreated, and still covered the rear with mobile fire. It was the invisible technical supremacy, not of the cannon but of the march. The testing ground wasn't in the factories, it was in the hills, and it was in the hills that the Hellcat proved to be more than a tank destroyer. It was a mobile, reliable, adaptable combat system. The real weapon was time, and time belonged to those who didn't need to stop. In the next chapter, we will witness the cumulative effect of this logic, because when the tanks break, the lines break. And so it was that the German flank began to unravel, not in explosions but in silence. A few days after the destruction at Aricourt, a memorandum was transmitted to the Wehrmacht High Command with the signature of General Hasso von Manteuffel. In it, a specific, almost desperate instruction: armored units must avoid chasing mobile hunters. Engagements on the move against fast vehicles should be avoided. The flank must be prioritized over protection. For any attentive analyst, it was not just an operational guideline. It was a confession. For the first time since the beginning of the Lightning War, the German doctrine of attack was forced to write the opposite of what it preached. The offensive war machine, which crushed Warsaw, crossed the Meuse and encircled entire armies in Russia, now called for caution, because the Hellcats had turned the tide. Not because they are invincible, but because they are unpredictable. This change in posture did not arise from theoretical debates, but from the reality in the fields of Lorraine. The 111th Panzer Regiment reported in November that the losses do not stem from the inferiority of guns or armor, but from the impossibility of maintaining visual contact with the enemy. It was the surrender of the frontal vision, what the Germans called instinctive hunting, the ability to follow and destroy the opponent with tactical precision, had now become a liability. Manteuffel, a Kursk veteran and one of Germany's most aggressive strategists, now ordered restraint. This in itself was already historic. To the American officials who intercepted the message, the contents sounded almost symbolic. They gave us the greatest medal we could receive. Official fear, Major Robert Wallace wrote in his diary. And the fear was well-founded, because the Hellcats didn't just destroy tanks, they destroyed the enemy's combat logic. A platoon of M18s could move, flank, and engage with such precision that the best German defense was retreat. A Panther positioned to ambush, upon seeing a Hellcat, was instructed not to fire if there was no positional advantage. That was the new doctrine, not to act as before. In the subsequent tactical exercises held by the Wehrmacht in November 1944, new simulations began to emerge based on the Hellcat phenomenon. The units were to practice situations of loss of eye contact, response to rapid attacks, and most tellingly, quiet zones, areas where mobile ambushes were presumed. Before, the Germans created death zones. Now they mapped out areas of caution. The reversal was brutal. And the most symbolic document came weeks later, when the General Staff itself attached to the Defense Directive of the Central Region of France the following note: avoid persecution of light American units with superior mobility. What was once arrogance has become a warning. What was once persecution has become a defense. The Germans didn't just recognize the change, they institutionalized it. And this, more than any punctual destruction, indicated the collapse of a doctrine. Because when an army is forced to stop fighting as it trained, it is no longer winning, it is surviving. In the next chapter, we'll dive into this long-term impact, because the war now was no longer measured in territorial advance, but in doctrinal adaptation, and the Germans, who had started out as masters of innovation, were now forced to imitate. December 1944. Winter fell upon the Ardennes forest with a force reminiscent of the East. The Wehrmacht, under pressure from the West, launched its last card, Operation Wacht am Rhein, what the world would know as the Battle of the Bulge. It was the last major German offensive effort, a desperate attempt to divide the Allies, regain momentum, and perhaps negotiate peace on their own terms. And once again, the offensive doctrine bet on the breaking power of the Panzers. The advance was centered on speed, surprise, and brute force. But what the Germans didn't know was that the war, once again, would move faster than they did, and at the head of the American counter-response, they were the Hellcats. On December 19th, units of the U.S. 10th Armored Division were ordered to reinforce defenses around Bastogne, a key point in the Belgian road network. One of his detachments, the Désabris Combat Group, was sent to the village of Noville, at the head of the main line of defense. On the way, 5 M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion sped into a forced march. In icy terrain, in blizzard, the vehicles reached speeds that no other tank would be able to maintain. Not only did they arrive before the Germans, they established position, dug in, camouflaged themselves, and were ready to fire when the 1st Panzer IV appeared on the ridge. The enemy heard the engine before seeing the enemy, and when he saw it, it was too late. American doctrine had evolved. Now the Hellcats weren't just hunters, they were mobile sentinels. They did not expect to be attacked. They chose where the enemy would be stopped. At Noville, the Hellcats hit 3 German tanks before they could maneuver. The crew used trees as cover, kept the engines running, and operated with direct radio coordination with the infantry of the 506th Parachute Regiment. With each shot, they retreated, repositioned, reappeared. The forest, snow-white, became a tactical board where every meter was calculated not by armor, but by speed. Over the course of 3 days, the Hellcats at Noville helped slow the German advance with breakthrough tactics. They did not hold the enemy by brute force, but by the collapse of time. The Germans, with heavier armor and increasing logistical difficulties, simply could not keep pace. In an excerpt from the diary of General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the XL7 Panzer Corps, there is a dry note. American resistance moves like steam. It appears and disappears. We can't flank. It was the echo of Arakort's nightmare, now under the snow of the Ardennes. And the data prove it. During the Battle of the Bulge, the average response time of a Hellcat detachment to an armored threat was less than 20 minutes, from message interception to combat position. No German armored units had reached that time. The superiority was not in the steel but in the reaction. Every Hellcat that arrived at the front was not just a weapon, it was an autonomous cell of doctrine in motion, able to operate independently, to communicate in real time. to adapt tactics to the terrain and the enemy, and that made them more than hunters. He made them catalysts for enemy tactical collapse. The psychological impact was also repeated. German crews reported the same feeling as Ericourt. Attacks from unexpected angles, sounds of unmarked engines, ambushes on icy roads. A Panzer grenadier commander wrote in his post-combat, "They surrounded us before we knew they were there, and when we shot, they were already gone." The ambush war, mobile, decentralized, showed that it was not a coincidence. It was a new model of combat, and the Hellcat was its spearhead. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of this phase is that even under extreme weather conditions, with oil freezing in German engines, with limited supplies, with rationed fuel, the Hellcats maintained an operating rate of over 80%. At various points, they served as improvised infantry reinforcements, as scouts, as mobile artillery pieces. The philosophy of simplicity has once again shown its value. Tanks that don't break down, don't stop. Tanks that don't stop, win. This is where the M18 transcends the role itself. It is no longer just a military vehicle. It is the reflection of a mentality. Act fast, think in the network, trust operators, not manuals. While Germany sank into its obsession with absolute power, the US won by the sum of intelligent adaptations. The tactical victory at Nouville, supported in part by the Hellcats, allowed the reinforcement of Bastogne, a decisive point for the resistance in the German offensive. The tanks that arrived first paved the way for the turn of the battle, and so it was that silently, a light open vehicle, considered vulnerable by many analysts, became a symbol of a victorious doctrine. At Ericourt, the Germans learned that force could be fooled by speed. In the Ardennes, they learned that speed could decide the course of a war. And in the next chapter, we will witness how the Hellcat, born as a tactical heresy, became a reference of modern combat for future generations, including the Germans themselves. In the post-war period, among the piles of reports, memoirs, and interviews conducted with Wehrmacht officers, a silent constant emerged: the Hellcat. It wasn't Sherman, it wasn't Pershing, it wasn't Thunderbolt roaring over the trees. The most feared vehicle in the field, according to countless veterans of Panzer battalions, was that fast, roofless tank destroyer that appeared where it was not supposed to be. Reports compiled by the Bundesarchiv throughout the 1950s and 1960s reveal that among American destroyers, the M18 was cited with almost obsessive frequency. The reason? It wasn't the firepower. It was the impossibility of predicting where and when it would appear. In the testimony of Hauptmann Dieter Krauss, former commander of a company of the 11th Panzer Regiment, there is a rare confession. He writes, "We didn't fear the Hellcats like tanks. We feared as one fears error. They forced us to question what we knew." This phrase sums up a feeling deeper than simple technical analysis. The Germans, trained to dominate by repetition, by infallible tactics, and by rigid doctrine, found on the field something that did not follow any of these rules. The M18 represented methodical chaos, a weapon that broke the predictable logic of armored warfare and forced its adversaries to abandon linear thinking. One of the elements most often highlighted by the Germans in post-war reports was the use of radios in all Hellcats. Unlike the Panthers, in which only the platoon commander had complete communications, the M18s operated with almost organic synchronization. Heinz Volker, radio operator of a surviving Panther from Ericourt, reported, "They changed positions with such speed and harmony that we thought we were facing 10 when there were only 2. This perception of ubiquity was one of the most devastating factors from a psychological point of view. The Hellcat didn't just destroy tanks, it dismantled the perception of safe space. Curiously, even in the internal doctrinal studies of the Bundeswehr, the new post-war German army, the Hellcat was the subject of analysis. In a 1959 document, classified as Zur Auswertung feindlicher Panzerabwehrmethoden, the M18 is cited as an example of Kombination von Mobilität und taktischer Freiheit, a combination of mobility and tactical freedom, an official recognition that, despite the material weaknesses, the tank destroyer stood out for creating a new way of operating. This did not mean that the Panther was obsolete. It meant that the Panther concept alone was no longer enough. Respect was not limited to theory. In the informal meetings between American and German veterans promoted in the 1980s by groups such as the World War II Reenactment Society, it was common to hear repeated stories about the ghosts of the camp. At one of these meetings, held in Stuttgart in 1983, a former company commander of 2 SS Panzer Division. Das Reich summed it up. The Hellcats have changed our stance. We started to enter the villages expecting not combat, but surprise. The recognition that the enemy could control the pace of battle, even with numerical and technical inferiority, was something unthinkable during the glory years of the Blitzkrieg. These confessions, often written in a cold, technical tone, concealed an uncomfortable truth. The Hellcat commanded respect where other vehicles failed. And this was due not to brute force but to surgical efficiency. It was faster than the Tiger, quieter than the Panther, more adaptable than any plastered tactic. His philosophy was American to the bone, to win by movement, by adaptability, by the mass production of a functional idea. And the Germans, even with their superior engineering, could not keep up with the mind behind the machine. Decades later, in comparative analyses carried out by military historians such as Stephen Zaloga, it became clear that the Hellcat's impact transcended its direct participation in battles. He influenced doctrinal concepts about mobility, anticipated the need for network-centric warfare, and proved that an effective weapon doesn't have to be invulnerable, it needs to be smart. The lesson, for the Germans, was bitter, but it was absorbed. The modern Bundeswehr would adopt years later light, agile vehicles with a focus on reconnaissance, communication, and flexibility, indirect heirs of an American tank destroyer that dared to run where the others stopped. The most symbolic, however, came in 1991, when an exhibition at the Munster Tank Museum brought together historical armor from the two powers. Between a Sherman and a Panther there was a restored Hellcat, and next to it a small plaque with the phrase of an anonymous German veteran. He was not handsome. It wasn't strong, but he was the only one we knew could be anywhere, and that was enough for us to fear him. This dry and unadorned phrase says more about the war than many manuals, because respect is not imposed by size. It is conquered by surprise, by effectiveness, by breaking paradigms. In the next and final chapter, we'll bring all these pieces together, tactical, technical, and moral, to understand how the M18 Hellcat became more than a vehicle, how he became a symbol of an era in which intelligent improvisation won over absolute rigidity, and how, even with thin armor and exposed design, it survived as one of the most respected adversaries of World War II. By the end of 1944, in the devastated forests of the Western Front, German armored superiority was no longer a fact. It was a memory. The doctrine that had once toppled Paris in 6 weeks now dragged on, dismantled by an enemy who preferred to run rather than resist, flank rather than face, mass-produce rather than perfect to the limit. The M18 Hellcat didn't just destroy tanks. It broke a mental model. The Panthers, the Tigers, the whole theology of heavy steel that had shaped the Wehrmacht since Poland, collapsed in the face of something that, in the eyes of the German High Command, did not even deserve to be called a threat. But war is not fought only with maps and calibers. It is decided in the workshops, in the factories, on the roads, in the minutes between an order and its execution. And that's when Germany lost, even before the first Hellcat fired. The United States won because it understood that tanks are more than armor. They are systems, and systems need to work even when the original plan fails. The Hellcat was the symbol of a new war, not the one dreamed up by the Berlin strategists, but the one that actually happened, a war of movement, of adaptation, of moral and tactical elasticity, a war where the fastest vehicle wasn't just the most dangerous, it was the smartest. The lesson is not in the caliber, but in the concept. Because true strength is not in resisting the world as it was, but in adjusting to the world as it has become. This is the great lesson of history. In war, as in industry, as in life, the one who builds the best equipment does not necessarily win, but the one who builds the right equipment for the right reality. The German doctrine invested in technical supremacy, the American one in full availability. And it was this difference that turned the battlefield upside down. In Ericourt, Belgium, in the Ardennes, it wasn't the cannon that made the difference. It was the engine, the radio, the stopwatch. It was the factory that was able to get a new Hellcat on the line in days, while the Germans were still trying to tow the next broken-down Panther. As General Alfred Jodl admitted in his report to the Demobilization Commission, we were not defeated by tanks, we were defeated by trucks, by supply, for a production line that didn't stop. If you value research, data, and the effort to accurately reconstruct the truth behind the battles, Enjoy this video and subscribe to the channel. It is this support that allows us to continue bringing real stories with depth and respect. And now, tell me in the comments, what was the most shocking data you discovered today? Activate the bell, because the next video will reveal another hidden detail that has become the fate of an entire army. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.